On July 21, 1969, American astronaut Neil Armstrong took his first steps on the moon. It was a huge technological and human achievement. But why had the race to the moon become such a focus, and how did the Americans get there first? 1950s, early space programs. The space race was part of the Cold War, 1947-89. The development of long-range ballistic missiles by the main protagonists, the Soviet Union and the United States of America, enabled the space race. However, it was actually a global scientific research program that both sides used to signal their intention of launching into space. In 1955, both the US and the USSR announced their intentions to launch artificial satellites into orbit. This was part of the International Geophysical Year, a research program to study the Earth during what would be the next period of heightened solar activity, 1957-58. The Soviet Union grabs the space firsts. To the surprise of many, it was the USSR that launched first with its Sputnik, fellow traveler, satellite on October 4, 1957. The following month, the Soviets launched a far bigger satellite, Sputnik 2, carrying the dog Laika into orbit, and this, perhaps, had a bigger impact. In the context of the Cold War, the larger satellite size implied the Soviets had the means and power to launch the then very heavy nuclear weapons and threaten mainland USA. The creation of a new space agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in 1958 was part of the American effort to better coordinate and plan an effective space program. But for the next 6 years, the Soviets continued to grab the headlines with more firsts, none more significant than putting the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin, in Vostok 1 on April 12, 1961. The space race to the moon is declared. U.S. President John F. Kennedy had initially shown little interest in spaceflight. But he changed his mind after seeing the public adulation given to both Gagarin and Shepard. Asking his advisors how the Soviets could be beaten, Kennedy decided that a manned moon mission would be necessary. This fired the starting gun for what eventually became a race between the United States and the Soviet Union to reach the moon first. The Soviet Union starts to drop behind? While the USSR continued to rack up more space firsts, first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, 1963, first multiple space crew, Voskhod 1, 1964, first spacewalk, Alexei Leonov, 1965. This was at the expense of any significant planning and resourcing of a moon mission. In 1964, the Soviet government gave the authorization undeclared to the world to proceed with the moon mission. But this was now 3 years after the US had started serious planning of its Apollo project, the program which would get a man on the moon. The US completed its Mercury program, flying a total of 6 astronauts into space to test the survivability of the human frame in space. This was followed by Project Gemini, a space program which flew 10 crews of 2 into space between 1965 and 1966. These missions paved the way for the Apollo program. These NASA missions demonstrated the ability to maneuver spacecraft, dock them together, and for astronauts to perform extended spacewalks, or EVAs, extravehicular activities. All these functions were necessary to land astronauts on the moon and bring them back safely to Earth. The human cost of spaceflight. However, there was a human cost to this push to the Finnish flag. Tragedy struck in 1967 when a fire broke out in the first manned Apollo capsule during a test on the launch pad. All 3 crew members perished: Ed White, Roger Chaffee, and Gus Grissom. The Soviet Union too suffered a horrendous setback that year when cosmonaut Vladimir Komarev crashed to Earth on the first flight of the Soyuz spacecraft, a new design intended for the core module of the USSR's manned lunar spacecraft design. This disaster followed on from the loss of Sergei Korolev, the Soviet chief space designer, during a routine medical operation in 1966. He had only recently been authorized to run the Soviet moon program, and the loss of this consummate manager was a blow for Soviet space ambitions. Summer 1968, a dilemma changes the momentum. By summer 1968, with the Apollo program near to returning to flight, the senior management of NASA was faced with a dilemma. Intelligence suggested the Soviets were near to launching a massive rocket, probably to the moon. The choice was between sticking with the Apollo mission schedule to test the lunar lander, which wasn't ready, or to go ahead with the inaugural manned flight of NASA's own rocket, the Saturn V. This mission would aim to send 3 astronauts around the moon. After feverish consultation across NASA, the outgoing administrator James Webb decided to proceed with the Saturn V mission. This would give the initiative back to the US and with it the necessary political momentum to try soon for an actual landing. The Soviets were indeed planning a mission around the moon, but with a crew of plants and small animals, including a pair of tortoises, rather than cosmonauts. This flew in September 1968, just 3 months before Apollo 8 took astronauts around the moon for the first time. One small step. The Apollo 8, and its circumnavigation of the moon, was a near-total success and grabbed all the right headlines for NASA. Not least those accompanied by the first Earthrise pictures taken from lunar orbit by astronaut William Anders. 5 months later, Apollo 10 flew a lander to within a few kilometers of the lunar surface. This was the first and only test of the Apollo spacecraft at the moon before the actual landing. Just 2 months after the Apollo 10 mission, Neil Armstrong stepped off the ladder of Eagle to make one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Ultimately, the better organization and higher funding levels to the American space program fueled their space race success. Why did the space race start? Following the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union competed to see who had the best technology in space. This included events such as the first satellite to orbit Earth, the first human-crewed spacecraft, and the first person to walk on the moon. The space race was considered vital by the two nations as it showed the world which country had the superior scientific, economic, and political systems. When did the space race end? The space race formally ended on July 17, 1975, when the US and Soviet Union linked up in orbit and shook hands during the Apollo-Soyuz mission. On July 17, 1975, the United States and the Soviet Union docked 2 spacecraft together in orbit as part of the Apollo-Soyuz test project, humanity's first international space mission. Over the course of 2 days, NASA astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts performed a series of scientific experiments and technology demonstrations. For some historians, the Apollo-Soyuz mission marked the formal end of the space race and the beginning of an extended era of international cooperation in space. Today, the spaceflight gets credit for helping pave the way for the Joint Shuttle-Mir space program, as well as the International Space Station. For decades, the space race had seen the two superpowers race to master and demonstrate many of the technologies needed to destroy each other with nuclear weapons. Yet, instead of ending in nuclear war, the space race concluded with a handshake in microgravity. Who won the space race? With no official measure of success, the winner of the space race is a point of controversy. Most historians agree that the space race ended on July 20, 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon for the first time. As the climax of space history and exploration, the lunar landing led to a triumph for the US. While the US set a man on the moon first, their success was fed by a series of pioneering achievements by the Soviet Union. The space race can be seen as a climactic comeback for the United States starting in 1968, rather than a decisive victory. Following the moon landing, the Soviet Union concentrated their efforts on building a space station. On June 7, 1971, the Soyuz 11 spacecraft successfully docked with the Salyut 1 space laboratory and completed a record 22-day stay, demonstrating that space exploration would continue. Furthermore, in May 1972, the US and the Soviet Union negotiated an easing of hostile relations. This thaw in the Cold War led to cooperation between the two nations on future missions, and the space race became a joint venture. Space race facts. 1. The first animals sent into space were fruit flies. These were carried aboard a Second World War V-2 rocket on February 20, 1947. 2. Dogs were sent into space. While the US often sent primates on test flights, the Soviet Union preferred to use dogs. They were seen to be more obedient, and Moscow stray dogs were reckoned to be more equipped to deal with the extreme conditions and potential hunger of space travel. 3. There is a solar-powered satellite. The U.S. Navy's Vanguard 1 was the first solar-powered satellite. Launched on March 17, 1958, it remains the oldest human-made probe in orbit. Although communication with the satellite is now lost, it will stay in space for many years to come. 4. Yuri Gagarin started a tradition. On the April 12, 1961, the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin asked the bus driver to stop on the route to the launch pad and urinated against the right-hand back tire of the bus. This act has become a tradition for all astronauts traveling into space. Female astronauts bring vials of their urine to splash on the wheel. 5. Astronauts were nearly cosmonauts. In the 1950s, an ongoing discussion began at NASA between astronauts and cosmonauts. The deputy administrator wanted to name U.S. travelers in space as cosmonauts, the term applied to Russian spacemen. He felt that cosmos was more applicable to space travel than just the term used to stars, or astro.